Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise before you to speak on an issue that is close to my heart. It is an issue that my colleague, the member for Esquimalt, Saanich, Sooke, has fiercely dedicated himself to over the years, of which we have just heard the long struggle and the fight he had. I am humbled to share my time with him today, and I do want to formally thank him for fighting to include explicit protections for gender identity and gender expression in the Canadian Human Rights Act. I also want to add my tributes to the groundbreaking work of former parliamentarians Sven Robinson, Bill C16, and Craig Scott, all of whom were instrumental in bringing us closer to the inclusive society we want to create. As the Deputy Critic for LGBTQ issues, I do want to acknowledge the work the government has done to bring this file forward, and I applaud them for taking this first critical step forward with the introduction of Bill C16. Let me begin by reminding the House, as my colleague had, that this legislation should come as no surprise. Identical legislation has been presented numerous times to the House over the last 5 years, most recently in 2015, when the bill was left to die on the Senate's order paper at the time the election was called. This bill has been studied, it's been reviewed, and most importantly, it has been accepted by elected members of the last Parliament. Now Bill C16 presents an opportunity for this government, this Parliament, to show leadership at a time when our country and our global community needs it the most. We know that existing provincial patchwork legislation is not sufficient. We know that only 7 of the 13 provinces and territories currently protect against discrimination based on gender expression and identity in their Human Rights Code. Canadians deserve swift federal action to provide leadership and to ensure protection in federal law against discrimination. Earlier this year, people from around the world witnessed the heartbreaking and gruesome events in Orlando. Words cannot convey how needless this tragedy was. The recent election in the United States, sadly, has given all of us even more reason to fear for our safety and our rights. May it serve as a heavy reminder that our global community remains unsafe for people who identify as LGBT or Q, and may we redouble our efforts to end bigotry and hatred. Madam Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Canada has an opportunity to show leadership within the international community. I suggest that we remember our responsibility as a signatory state to the UN Declaration on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. Let's affirm our commitment to these obligations and secure equal rights for trans and gendered variant Canadians by adding gender identity and expression as prohibited grounds for discrimination under the Canada Human Rights Act. As our country strives to be more inclusive, I will reflect momentarily upon the past, which unfortunately is riddled with instances of discrimination and violence towards the LGBTQ community, but thankfully is also full of tales of hope and resistance. Not so long ago, on February 5, 1981, more than 250 gay men were arrested in Toronto for visiting bathhouses. Many of those arrested in Operation Soap were publicly humiliated and faced lifelong repercussions as a result of this assault. I urge that we do not forget these dark moments in our history as we forge our way forward to a future that is more fair and just for all Canadians. In my riding and the surrounding area, Mr. Speaker, we have a strong record of organization and activism around LGBTQ issues. From the Saskatoon Gay Liberation led by Jens Hellquist in the 1970s, to Gay and Lesbian Health Services started in 1991, which continues its important work today as Out Saskatoon, to the annual Breaking the Silence Conference, now in its 20th year, organized by Education Professor Don Cochran at the University of Saskatchewan. In 1999, Mount Royal Collegiate, a high school in my riding, was the first high school in the province to have a Gay-Straight Alliance for students, spearheaded by teacher Patty Rowley. And in June of this year, Beardy's Okamesis First Nation held the first ever Two-Spirit Pride Parade and Festival on a First Nation in Saskatchewan. We are lucky to have a robust history of community activism and work. This activism has pushed governments to recognize the rights of the LGBTQ community and has, in many cases, provided essential services to those who need it most. But organizations and community activists alone cannot ensure that the rights of the LGBTQ community are respected. We need federal protections that explicitly prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender expression and identity. We need Bill C16. When the Justice Minister introduced this bill, she noted, and I quote, that all Canadians should be safe to be themselves. And I don't believe any one of us would disagree with that. But the hard truth of the matter is that not all people in Canada are safe to be themselves. Systemic discrimination towards the LGBTQ community persists across Canada, and perhaps most notably in our schools. LGBTQ students are 3 times more likely than heterosexual students to be bullied. Roughly 74% of trans students report having been verbally harassed about their perceived gender identity or sexual orientation, and nearly 40% of trans students report having been physically assaulted. The bravery displayed by our young people who report physical and verbal assault after it happens is truly remarkable. But of course, I am heartbroken, as many are, and utterly dismayed by the fact that over 7 out of 10 trans students are being harassed because of who they are. Mr. Speaker, it's not just young trans Canadians who desperately need a more compassionate Canadian society. Trans and gender-variant Canadians of all ages face unique barriers. Many Canadians are unable to secure identification that correctly reflects their gender identity, which in turn imposes severe restrictions on their mobility and limits access to essential services. Those who identify as trans or gender variant face a real struggle to earn a decent standard of living. They are discriminated against in the workplace and are often unemployed or underemployed. We cannot stand idly by while such discrimination takes place in the workplace. Mr. Speaker, in 2016, we need safe, gender-neutral spaces, including public washrooms. For Canadians who identify as trans or gender variant, this challenge can be at best a nightmare or at worst life-threatening. It's unacceptable that so many Canadians face these challenges each and every day. We must do better, and we can start by extending trans and gender variant Canadians the same rights and protections that all Canadians enjoy under Canada's Human Rights Act. We have so much work to do in order to achieve the inclusive Canada we all envision, Mr. Speaker. But we have an exciting opportunity before us to make the lives of trans and gender variant Canadians better by supporting Bill C16. This bill is an important and critical step forward on a long, slow, but steady march forward in the struggle to enshrine in law equality for all. Next week, communities, starting on Sunday, communities all over Canada and around the world will pause on November 20th to observe the Transgender Day of Remembrance. On that day, we will remember and honor those who have died due to transphobia. Let us not just remember, let us not just honor, but let us act. I urge the government to act, to pass this long-due legislation without delay. I urge all members of this House to support Bill C16 to ensure the protection of human rights for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.